There is a moment that arrives in some people's lives that does not announce itself. It does not come with a warning or a build-up or any of the dramatic signals we have been conditioned by movies and television to expect before the world changes. It comes quietly. It comes in an ordinary envelope, between a utility bill and a church newsletter, on an ordinary Tuesday morning on a dirt road in rural Tennessee. And the woman who pulls that envelope from the mailbox is wearing the same clothes she slept in, which are the same clothes she wore to bury her husband the day before. And the handwriting on the front of the envelope is his. And the postmark in the upper right corner is dated 3 days after he died. And she does not scream. She does not drop it. She stands in the fog at the end of the driveway, and she opens it, and she reads it. And when she walks back inside, nothing about her life, or his, will ever be the same again. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching from. We would love to hear from our community all across the country and around the world. And if you are new here and this is the first time you have found this channel, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We cover stories exactly like this one, stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark, stories about ordinary people living ordinary lives, right up until the moment they are not. Now let us go back to the beginning, because to understand what that letter meant, and why it arrived when it did, and what it set in motion the moment Margaret Harwell finished reading it, you have to understand who Margaret and Thomas Harwell were, and more importantly, who everyone around them believed them to be. Margaret and Harwell was the kind of woman that small towns are quietly held together by. Born and raised in Hardin County, Tennessee, she had spent the better part of her adult life teaching 4th grade at the same elementary school, in the same classroom, with the same patient and unshakable belief that every child who sat in front of her deserved someone firmly and unconditionally in their corner. She knew every family in her zip code by name and by story. She remembered every student's birthday without being reminded. She was the person the church called when the potluck needed organizing, the person her neighbors called when something went wrong and they didn't know where else to turn, the person who showed up with food and stayed until you didn't need her anymore. She was the kind of woman who gave more than she took, who asked for almost nothing, and who believed, with a depth and a quiet stubbornness that the people who loved her found both admirable and occasionally heartbreaking, in the fundamental goodness of the people in her life. She met Thomas at a church social in the summer of 2007. She was 38 years old. He was 43. Neither of them had been married before. Neither of them had expected, at that particular stage of their lives, to find someone, to find the person. And yet everyone who watched them together in those early months said the same thing without being asked, and without any particular effort to put it into words. They just fit, not in a loud or demonstrative way, not in the way of couples who perform their happiness for whatever room they happen to be standing in the quiet way, the steady, unannounced, take-it-for-granted way of two people who have each spent long enough alone to recognize, without needing to narrate it, that they have found the person they were waiting for. They married the following spring in a simple ceremony at the same church where they met. They bought a house on 12 acres outside of Savannah, Tennessee. They planted a garden. They went to church most Sundays. They built the kind of life that looks, from the outside, entirely uncomplicated. Thomas Raymond Harwell was harder to read than his wife. That was simply the truth of him, and the people who knew him understood it and respected it and did not hold it against him. He was soft-spoken and methodical. He worked in insurance, property assessments, claims analysis, risk evaluation, a profession that suited with unusual precision a man whose natural gift was noticing the details that other people skimmed past without a second look. He was not cold and he was not unfriendly, but he kept his interior life close to his chest, in the particular way of men who have learned early that the world does not always handle carefully the things you hand it. His co-workers respected him deeply. His neighbors liked him. But if you pressed any of them honestly, past the polite surface of easy description, very few would have said they truly knew Thomas Harwell. He was the kind of man who did what he said he would do and showed up when he said he would show up and required no acknowledgement from anyone for either of those things. That combination, Margaret's open warmth and Thomas's guarded privacy, seemed to work for them in the particular way that opposite temperaments sometimes do when each person has what the other genuinely lacks. She filled the rooms of their life together. He watched the doors. She introduced herself to strangers at every church dinner and remembered their names the following Sunday. He remembered what those strangers had mentioned in passing and asked after it weeks later when no one expected him to. She trusted first and reconsidered slowly. He assessed carefully, trusted once, and held it for good. Together they occupied a particular kind of quiet, contented, untroubling life that people in Hardin County recognized without needing to examine it. There were no rumors about Margaret and Thomas Harwell. There was no drama attached to their name. They were simply Thomas and Margaret. The Thomas Harwell died on a Saturday morning in October. It was just past 6 in the morning, and the sky outside the bedroom window was still dark. Margaret was already up, the way she usually was before sunrise, moving through the kitchen with the particular quiet efficiency of a woman who has organized her mornings down to the smallest detail over many years of early school schedules. She was making the first pot of coffee of the day, and then she heard a sound from the bedroom. She would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right word for what she heard, and she would never fully find it. Wrong was the closest she ever got. Not loud, not violent, just wrong. The sound of something giving way inside a person in a way that cannot be reversed or corrected or undone. She went to him immediately. He was unresponsive. She called 911, and she began CPR, her hands pressed to his chest, counting out loud the way she had been taught in a school safety course decades before, her voice steady in the still quiet of their bedroom, while the dispatcher stayed on the line, and the October sky outside the window moved slowly from black to the dull, flat gray of early dawn. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. In rural Tennessee, 11 minutes is a fast response by any standard. That Saturday morning in October, it was not fast enough. Thomas Raymond Harwell was pronounced dead at 6:47 in the morning. The cause was acute myocardial infarction, a massive, sudden, catastrophic heart attack. He had no history of heart disease, no prior cardiac events, no documented risk factors beyond age. He had passed a routine physical examination 8 months earlier without a single clinical flag. His physician, when contacted in the days following Thomas's death, described his medical history using the word unremarkable, which in the specific language of medicine means exactly what every patient hopes it will mean. There was no investigation. There was no reason for one. A 58-year-old man with no known cardiac history had died of a heart attack in his own home on a Saturday morning in October. It was a tragedy. It was final. And it was, as far as anyone could determine, entirely straightforward. What followed for Margaret was the machinery of sudden loss, the relentless, grinding, practical series of demands that grief sends to your door before you have had even a single moment to sit down and absorb the reality of what has happened. The phone calls, the decisions about arrangements, open casket or closed, which suit, which hymns, who would speak, and what they would say. Thomas had no living siblings. His parents were long gone. There was a cousin named Gary, a quiet and decent man from Memphis, who drove in for the service and left the same afternoon. The funeral was held on a Monday at First Baptist Church in Savannah, Tennessee. 61 people signed the guest book. Margaret sat in the front pew and held the hand of her closest friend, a woman named Darlene Mosley, who had known Margaret since their college years and who had driven 3 hours without being asked, without hesitating. Arriving at the house the evening Thomas died with food she had made herself and a willingness to stay as long as she was needed. By 3 o'clock on that Monday afternoon, Thomas Harwell was in the ground at Hardin County Memorial Gardens, beneath a sky the color of old pewter, beneath the kind of October clouds that look like they are holding something in. Margaret drove home alone. She sat in the kitchen for a long time. She did not eat. She eventually fell asleep in the armchair beside the window that looked out over the back field, the one Thomas used to sit in on Sunday mornings with his coffee and the newspaper, with the television on and the volume turned completely off, because the silence of that house was something she was not yet prepared to sit inside, and the television at least gave the silence a shape. The silence of a house where a person used to be is a very particular and very terrible kind of quiet. It has a weight to it. It presses against you from every direction. Margaret Harwell had never lived alone, and she did not yet know how to begin. Tuesday morning she woke before the sun, the way she always did, the way the body continues doing the things it has always done even when the reason for doing them has been removed. She made coffee in the same pot, from the same chair at the same kitchen table, looking out the same window over the same field, because routine is the thing the body reaches for when the mind has nothing left to hold on to. She pulled on her coat over the clothes she had slept in. She walked outside into the fog, the thick, low, soft gray fog that settles into the fields in that part of Tennessee in October, the kind that makes the world feel smaller and quieter and more contained than it actually is. She walked to the end of the driveway. She opened the mailbox, and between a utility bill and a church newsletter from First Baptist, there was a white envelope. Standard size. Her name written on the front in handwriting she would have recognized in any light, under any circumstance, for the rest of her life. The same slight leftward slant she had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter for 15 years. Their home address in the return corner. And in the upper right, a postmark. October 14th. Thomas had died on October 11th. She did not drop the envelope. She did not make a sound. She stood at the end of the driveway in the October fog, in her coat over her funeral clothes from the day before, and she opened it. She pulled out 4 pages of handwriting, folded together in the careful, deliberate way of a man who did everything with a certain considered precision. And she read them, standing there, at the end of the driveway, in the cold. All 4 pages. Every word, from the first line to the last. Then she walked back inside, sat down at the kitchen table, set the letter in front of her with both hands, and did not move for 3 hours. She did not call Darlene. She did not call the pastor who had stood at Thomas's graveside the day before and spoken about the quiet dignity of a good man's life. She did not call anyone. She sat in the kitchen that smelled like Thomas's coffee and Thomas's mornings and the slow, accumulated texture of 15 years of shared life. And she read 4 pages from a man who had been in the ground since Monday afternoon, and she tried to understand what she was holding. Margaret Harwell would not tell a single person about the letter for 4 full days. Not Darlene, who called twice. Not her pastor, who left a voicemail Wednesday morning to check on her. Not Gary, the cousin from Memphis, who sent a brief and kindly worded message on Thursday. She took the letter from the kitchen table, folded it carefully along its original creases, and placed it in the drawer of her nightstand, on top of her Bible, the same Bible she had carried since college, with her name written inside the front cover in her mother's handwriting. And she kept it there, and she sat with it alone. She read it again on Wednesday night, in bed, with the lamp on. She read it again on Thursday morning at the kitchen table, with her second cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. Each reading gave back something the previous reading had withheld, a detail she had seen with her eyes but not yet allowed herself to process, a sentence whose weight she had registered and then pulled back from, the way you pull your hand away from something that turns out to be hotter than you expected. When she finally told Darlene on Friday afternoon, sitting at the same kitchen table, the letter lying flat between them, Darlene's first response was the one any reasonable and caring person would reach for. There was a logical explanation. The Postal Service made mistakes. Letters got delayed in the system all the time. Maybe Thomas had written it weeks before he died, and it had simply sat somewhere, and the postmark reflected when it was finally processed rather than when it was originally sent. These things happened. Darlene was not being dismissive. She was being what she had always been to Margaret, a steady, practical presence who looked for the explanation that required the least to be true and caused the least harm. And Margaret let her finish. And then she told Darlene the one piece of information she had not mentioned yet. The postmark was not local. It was not from Hardin County. It had been stamped at the Nashville Distribution Center, 120 miles away from their home on the 12 acres outside of Savannah. Thomas had not been to Nashville in the weeks before his death. Margaret was certain of this. She had his calendar, which she had been going through methodically since the morning he died, the way a grieving spouse moves through every record a person leaves behind, not looking for anything specific, just trying to stay close to them through the evidence of their ordinary days, through the proof that they existed in concrete and particular ways. She had his gas receipts from the filing cabinet in his home office. She had his phone, which she had been carrying in her coat pocket since the morning he died, scrolling through the way you do when you are not looking for anything and looking for everything at the same time. Nashville was not in any of it. Not on the calendar. Not in the receipts. Not on the phone. Thomas Harwell had not been 120 miles from home in the weeks before his death. And yet a letter in his handwriting had entered the postal system in Nashville and been routed to their mailbox and arrived on the Tuesday morning after his Monday funeral, processed without irregularity, delivered without incident, as though nothing about it was unusual in any way. Darlene went with her to the post office. A clerk pulled the records and confirmed what the postmark said. October 14th, Nashville Distribution Center. Processed and routed through standard channels. No irregularity in the system. No anomaly. No flag. As far as the United States Postal Service was concerned, this was an entirely ordinary piece of first-class mail that had moved from a sender in Nashville to a recipient in Hardin County through entirely ordinary means. The only fact that could not be reconciled, the only detail that the postal system's perfect record-keeping made more impossible rather than less, was that the name in the return address corner belonged to a man who had been pronounced dead 3 days before that letter entered any postal system anywhere in the state of Tennessee. Margaret called Thomas's office in Jackson that same afternoon. She asked to speak with his supervisor, a man named Ray Colston, who had sent a large flower arrangement to the funeral with a card in which he described Thomas as one of the finest professionals and one of the finest men he had ever had the privilege of working beside. Ray expressed his condolences again when Margaret identified herself. He asked whether there was anything he could do, and then Margaret asked him a question she had not planned in advance. Had Thomas been to Nashville recently? For work or for anything else? Whether anyone at the office would know about a trip in the days before his death? And Ray Colston was quiet for a moment. Not a long moment, but long enough to be a moment. And then he said that Thomas had taken a personal day on Thursday, October 9th, 2 days before his death. He had called in himself that morning, early, before most people arrived, and left a brief message saying he had a personal matter he needed to attend to. Ray had thought nothing of it. Thomas was a reliable and trusted employee with years of accumulated leave who almost never used it. He owed no one an explanation, and he had not offered one. At the time, there had been no reason to think about it at all. Thursday, October 9th. A personal day with no explanation given. 120 miles to Nashville and back. A letter dropped in a mailbox. And then 2 ordinary days, a Friday working from home, a Saturday morning at 6, and then the sound Margaret would spend years trying to name correctly, the sound from the bedroom that she would only ever be able to describe as wrong. Between the personal day on Thursday and the heart attack on Saturday, there were 48 hours. And in those 48 hours, Thomas Harwell had come home from Nashville and sat down to dinner and slept and worked and lived what appeared to be 2 entirely ordinary days. And he had not told Margaret anything about where he had been or what he had done there. He had carried those 48 hours the same way he had carried so much else. Quietly, completely, without any outward indication that anything was different. Margaret went home from that phone call and opened the nightstand drawer. She took out the letter. She sat at the kitchen table with it for the 4th time. And this time she did not read it looking for comfort or closeness or the sound of his voice in the particular slant of his handwriting. She read it looking for the thing she had registered the first time and retreated from before she was ready to carry it. The thing on the 3rd page that she had read and then immediately, instinctively, set down inside herself at a distance. The way the mind protects you from information it can tell you are not yet equipped to receive in full. She found it again. And this time she made herself read it all the way through to the end. And when she was finished, she sat with her hands flat on the table and the letter in front of her and the October light coming through the kitchen window. And she understood why Thomas had driven to Nashville on a Thursday. And she understood the postmark. And she understood the locked desk drawer. And she understood, in one slow and terrible and comprehensive moment, the particular shape of the 15 years they had built together and the particular shape of what had been moving underneath those years without her knowing it was there. To understand what Margaret found on that 3rd page, you have to go back further than the funeral and further than the heart attack and further than the Thursday personal day in Nashville. You have to go back to the beginning of something Thomas Harwell had been constructing in silence and in parallel to his ordinary life for years. Because Thomas Harwell had a bank account that Margaret had never known about. It had been opened 6 years into their marriage at a bank in Nashville, under his name alone. It did not appear in their joint finances. The amounts he had moved into it over the years were small enough and deliberately irregular enough in their timing and their size that they had never triggered any notice from anyone. A few $100s here from a redirected savings deposit. A modest sum there from a bonus taken as a paper check rather than a direct deposit into their joint account. The kind of careful, patient, long-term accumulation that only a man with Thomas Harwell's particular attention to detail and his particular capacity for maintaining a thing over time without needing anyone else to witness it could have managed for as long as he did. By the time Margaret read the letter on that fourth occasion, sitting at the kitchen table in the October afternoon light, the account held just over $43,000. And it existed, Thomas wrote, entirely and completely for her. He had started it, he explained, because he had always carried a fear he had never said out loud, the fear of what would happen to her if something happened to him. The house was paid down, but not paid off. Margaret's teacher's salary covered their shared life comfortably, but left no real cushion for an emergency, no real buffer between the life they had and the difficulty that could arrive without warning. Thomas had wanted her to have time. Not wealth, not luxury, not anything extravagant. Just time. The specific and invaluable gift of time. The ability to make decisions about the house and the land and her own future without the immediate crushing pressure of financial necessity arriving at the same moment as grief. He had never told her because he was afraid she would see it as morbid. A man who quietly and patiently prepares for his own absence is a man who has already begun, in some internal sense, to leave. He had not wanted to be that man in her eyes. He had planned to transfer the entire account into their joint savings when he retired. He had planned to tell her about it then, to present it as a gift, a surprise, something practical wrapped in something tender, a story about how much he had wanted to protect her and how long he had been working at it. He had planned to watch her face when she understood what he had done and why. He never got to retire. He never got to watch her face. And so instead he told her in a letter postmarked from Nashville, from the city where the account was held, at the bank where he had gone on his personal day to update the beneficiary designation and ensure the transfer would happen cleanly and without legal complication the moment she presented herself at the counter with the right documents. He gave her the account number. He gave her the branch address. He gave her the name of the banker he had spoken with on that Thursday. He told her exactly what to bring and exactly what to say. It was, in every practical and human sense, the last thing Thomas Raymond Harwell ever organized for the person he loved most in the world. And Margaret, reading it for the fourth time, sitting with the part of the letter that was purely and simply and unambiguously love, let herself stay there for a long moment before she turned the page. Before she came to page 3. Because page 3 was the reason he had gone to Nashville in person rather than simply mailing her a letter from home with the account information inside it. Page 3 was the weight she had felt in the letter from the very first reading. The thing that sat beneath the tenderness of the first 2 pages like a stone beneath still water, present and cold and unchanging. Page 3 was what Thomas had known for 18 months. What he had tried to resolve on his own and failed to resolve. What he had carried in the locked desk drawer and the outside phone calls and the particular quietness that came over him at certain moments, and what he had ultimately decided he could not take with him into whatever came next without leaving it somewhere Margaret would eventually find it. He had chosen her mailbox. He had chosen the only moment he was certain she would be ready, or as ready as any person can be, to receive it. Page 3 was about Ray Colston. Ray Colston had spent 30 years building a career in the insurance industry on the foundation of 2 things, precision and reputation. He was methodical, thorough, and widely regarded as a man of professional integrity. He had hired Thomas 11 years before Thomas died, had been a mentor to him in the early years of their working relationship, and had given Thomas the degree of professional autonomy and trust that Thomas's particular way of working required and deserved. By every account from the people who worked alongside them, they had a collegial relationship grounded in mutual respect and a shared commitment to doing the work correctly, which was precisely what made what Ray Colston had been doing to the firm's client accounts for at least 4 years before Thomas Harwell died, something that Thomas had found almost impossible to believe when the evidence first appeared in front of him. Not because he was naive, but because the person doing it was someone he had trusted with his professional life for over a decade. It had started small. These things almost always do. Adjustments to claims assessments, small, careful, individually defensible reductions in client payouts that, standing alone, looked like the normal exercise of professional judgment. fees redirected through internal processing codes that existed legitimately in the firm's system but were rarely scrutinized by anyone above the clerical level. Amounts modest enough on their own to stay beneath the thresholds that triggered automatic internal review, but consistent enough in their pattern and cumulative enough in their total to add up, over 4 years, to something very significant. It required, to work without detection for that long, one additional layer of operational cover. The documents that moved through the system needed to be processed and filed by someone on the administrative side who would handle the paperwork without looking too carefully at the numbers inside it. Someone who would initial the files and move them forward and not ask the questions that a more attentive or more skeptical I might have asked. That administrative cover was the second piece of what Thomas documented. And it was the piece that made the whole thing work. And it was the piece that appeared on page 3 of the letter that arrived in Margaret Harwell's mailbox on a Tuesday morning. Thomas had discovered the fraud 18 months before he died. He had not been looking for it. He had been reviewing a batch of client files in preparation for an unrelated internal audit when he noticed a pattern, a particular category of assessment adjustment appearing in claims files that he had personally evaluated, in amounts he had not authorized, processed through his access credentials on dates when he had not been logged into the system. He recognized immediately what he was looking at. He sat with it alone for 2 full weeks before he said anything to anyone. And then he confronted Ray Colston directly, privately, without involving anyone else at the firm, without going to the state insurance regulators, without doing anything that could not be undone if Ray offered an explanation that changed the shape of what Thomas thought he was seeing. He gave Ray every possible benefit of every possible doubt, because that was the kind of man Thomas Harwell was. He believed in doing things right before he did them at all, and he believed, or wanted to believe, that the right thing in this particular situation was to give a man he had worked beside for 11 years the chance to explain himself before Thomas became the person who ended his career and potentially his freedom. Ray Colston did not deny it. He did not offer an alternative explanation or claim that Thomas had misread the data. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said that he was in a difficult position. That exact phrase, a difficult position, was something Thomas wrote down in the letter almost with a kind of quiet bewilderment, as if even there, on those 4 handwritten pages prepared at what turned out to be the very end of his life, he still could not entirely account for the particular audacity of that particular description. Ray asked Thomas for time. He promised to stop the activity immediately, to find a way to repay what had been taken, to make things right without destroying what both of them had spent their careers building. And Thomas, against what his professional training and his own better judgment were almost certainly telling him, gave Ray that time. Not because he fully believed him, but because he had not yet found a way to be the person who pulled the thread that would unravel everything and see where it led. He wrote in the letter with a directness that sat on the page like a confession of its own, trying to be decent about something that did not deserve decency. The fraud did not stop. It slowed and it shifted and it changed its pattern and moved through different file types and different processing codes, the way something does when the person doing it knows it has been seen and needs to become harder to find. But it continued, and Thomas, who had been watching with the particular focused attention of a man who now knew exactly what he was looking for, tracked every movement. For 18 months he tracked it and documented it and said nothing publicly. He kept records, dates, amounts, file numbers, access codes, transaction timestamps, careful, methodical, complete records, organized in the locked desk drawer in his home office, in a set of folders that sat alongside the actual client files he had described to Margaret all along. He had been building a case, not the kind a prosecutor builds, with the resources and authority of an institution behind it, but the kind a meticulous and private man builds when he has decided that the truth needs to exist somewhere in a form that cannot be argued with. The kind of case that, once assembled, could be handed to someone who would know what to do with it. On Thursday, October 9th, 2 days before a heart attack that arrived with no warning and no history, Thomas Harwell drove 120 miles to Nashville. He went first to the bank where the account existed. The account with $43,000 set aside entirely for the woman he had been married to for 15 years. He updated the beneficiary designation. He made sure the transfer would happen cleanly. He spoke with the banker whose name he would include in the letter. And then he sat down, somewhere in Nashville, in a car or a diner or a room we have no record of. And he wrote 4 pages in his careful leftward hand, and he folded them into a white envelope, and he wrote his wife's name on the front, and he put their home address in the return corner, and he walked to a mailbox, and he dropped it in. And then he drove home, and he had dinner, and he slept, and he worked from home on Friday. And on Saturday morning at 6 his heart stopped in the bedroom of the house on 12 acres outside of Savannah, and by Monday afternoon he was in the ground at Hardin County Memorial Gardens. And on Tuesday morning, exactly the way he had planned, the letter arrived. But there is something that has not yet been said, something that was on page 3 of that letter, something beyond Ray Colston and the fraud and the 18 months of quiet, meticulous documentation. Something that was the real weight Margaret had set down inside herself at a careful distance on that first reading and had only allowed herself to fully pick up on the fourth. Because Ray Colston had needed administrative cover. He had needed someone on the processing side who would initial the documents and move the files forward without asking the questions that should have been asked. And Thomas had documented that person too. He had included their name in the letter with the same thoroughness and the same grief. And it was grief. You can feel it in the way he wrote around it before he wrote through it, with which he had documented everything else. Because the person who had provided Ray Colston with the administrative cover he needed to run this fraud without detection for 4 years was not a stranger to the Harwell household. It was not someone Margaret had met once at an office party and never thought about again. It was Darlene Mosley, Margaret's closest friend, the woman who had known her since college. The woman who had driven 3 hours without being asked the night Thomas died and arrived with food she had made herself. The woman who had sat in the front pew of First Baptist Church and held Margaret's hand while Thomas was lowered into the ground. The woman who had sat across the kitchen table from Margaret on a Friday afternoon and listened with every expression of concerned bewilderment that a human face can produce to the story of the impossible letter. A letter whose existence and whose contents Darlene Mosley had every reason, though Margaret did not yet understand this, to be very much afraid of. Darlene had been working in the firm's administrative office for 3 years. It was a part-time position she had taken after a period of financial difficulty that she had described to Margaret at the time as temporary and embarrassing in the specific way that financial hardship tends to embarrass people who are not accustomed to it. And it was a position Margaret had helped her get. Margaret had spoken to Thomas about it, had asked him, as a favor, whether there might be something available on the administrative side for a friend who needed steady work. And Thomas, who had known by then what Ray Colston was doing, who had known by then who was processing the documents, who had known and had been carrying that knowledge in the locked desk drawer and the outside phone calls and the particular private quietness that came over him at certain moments, had passed the word along, and Darlene Mosley had been hired. Thomas wrote in the letter that he did not know with certainty how to account for all of that. He wrote that it was possible, genuinely possible, not charitably possible, but actually possible, that Darlene had not understood at first what she was initialing, that the fraud had been constructed in a way that revealed itself gradually, and that by the time its full shape would have been apparent to anyone paying attention, Darlene was already inside it in ways that made it difficult to simply step back out. He wrote that his documentation reflected this uncertainty and that he had been careful not to overstate what he could prove about her level of awareness in the beginning. But he wrote that she had continued, that over 3 years of part-time administrative work, she had initialed files and processed documents and moved paperwork through the system, and that whatever the nature of her understanding at the start, the continuation was not something he could leave out of the record he was leaving for Margaret, because it was part of the truth. And the truth, the whole truth, with all its irregular and painful edges intact, was what he was trying to give her. He wrote, at the end of that passage, a single sentence that Margaret would read more times than any other sentence on those 4 pages. He wrote, "I know what this costs you. I am sorry I could not find a way to tell you that did not come from here." She sat with that sentence for a very long time, and then she picked up the phone, and she called a lawyer. The investigation into Ray Colston's fraud took 7 months from the day Margaret Harwell walked into an attorney's office with 4 handwritten pages and a postmarked envelope, and the carefully organized contents of a locked desk drawer in her late husband's home office. The Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance opened a formal inquiry. A forensic accounting firm was retained. The documentation Thomas had assembled over 18 months of quiet, private, Methodical observation was handed to investigators who described it in internal communications that would later become part of the public case record, as unusually complete and unusually organized for material produced by a non-professional source. Thomas Harwell had not been a forensic accountant or a trained investigator. He had been a property assessor who paid close attention to the way numbers moved and understood, perhaps better than most, the precise difference between what a figure said on a page and what it actually meant when you traced where it came from and where it went. He had built something that professionals with formal training found they did not need to substantially supplement. He had simply been thorough. It was, in the end, the most Thomas Harwell thing imaginable. Ray Colston, when confronted with the full, documented scope of what Thomas had assembled, did not attempt to fight it. He resigned from the firm within a week of the inquiry opening. He retained a criminal defense attorney and spent the following months in negotiations with prosecutors that produced a plea agreement covering wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and misappropriation of client funds. The sentence was 4 years, with the possibility of early release for good behavior. The restitution order ran to a significant sum that covered a substantial portion of what had been taken from the firm's clients over 4 years. It did not make national headlines. Ray Colston was not a famous man, and his victims were insurance policyholders in rural West Tennessee rather than shareholders in a publicly traded company. The story made the local paper in Hardin County twice, once when the inquiry opened and once when the plea was entered. The second story ran on a Tuesday. Margaret noticed. She filed it without comment. Darlene Mosley cooperated with the investigation from her very first meeting with investigators, a cooperation her attorney presented as evidence of remorse and as a factor that should weigh significantly in how the prosecution assessed her culpability. Her attorney argued that her involvement had been the product of a gradual process, a series of individual steps, each one small enough to seem manageable, each one making the next step slightly easier, until she found herself somewhere she had not intended to go and could not easily find her way back from. Investigators did not fully accept that framing, but they accepted enough of it, and her cooperation was substantive enough to support offering her a significantly reduced charge in exchange for her complete testimony against Ray Colston. She received a suspended sentence, a substantial financial penalty, court-ordered restitution payments, and the permanent revocation of any license to work in financial services or in any role involving the handling of financial documents. She did not go to prison. She left Hardin County before the terms of the agreement were fully finalized. She left quietly, the way people leave when they understand that the place they are leaving has nothing left to offer them. She and Margaret Harwell have not spoken a single word to each other since the Friday afternoon, when Darlene sat across the kitchen table and listened to the story of the impossible letter and produced, with what must have required considerable effort, every expression of astonishment and concern and bewilderment that the situation called for. Margaret Harwell still lives on the 12 acres outside of Savannah. She still teaches 4th grade at the same school where she has spent 19 years of her professional life. She still attends First Baptist Church most Sunday mornings. She still keeps the garden that she and Thomas planted together every spring, and she still brings the lemon pound cake to the church bake sale every fall, because these are the things she has always done, and because the continuity of ordinary things is one of the few genuine mercies available to people who have lost the person they did them with. The account in Nashville. The $43,000 Thomas Harwell had built over 9 years of careful, patient, private accumulation redirected dollars by deliberate dollar into a bank account 120 miles from home, transferred to Margaret cleanly and without complication, exactly the way he had arranged for it to on that Thursday morning when he drove to Nashville and sat with a banker and updated a beneficiary designation and then sat down somewhere and wrote 4 pages by hand. The house is paid off. The land is hers. She has the time he spent 9 years trying to make sure she would have. She framed the envelope, not the letter. She has kept the letter private, and she has said, when asked, that she intends to keep it that way, that some things belong to the person they were written to and to no one else. But the envelope she had framed, his handwriting on the front in the familiar leftward slant, the postmark in the upper right corner, October 14th, their home address in the return corner. It hangs in the hallway between the kitchen and the bedroom, where she passes it going in both directions every single morning and every single night. She passes it on the way to make coffee, and she passes it on the way to bed, and she has never, as far as anyone who knows her has been able to determine, considered taking it down. She has been asked, more than once, by people who knew Thomas and people who only know the story and people who fall somewhere in between, whether she is angry at him. For the silence. For the 18 months he spent documenting and tracking rather than acting. For the locked desk drawer and the outside phone calls and the particular private quietness. For the secret account that she might, under different circumstances, have found to be less a gift than a wound. For the fact that the most important conversation of their marriage arrived in a white envelope between a utility bill and a church newsletter, 3 days after she watched his casket go into the ground. She says she is not angry. She says she came to understand, in the months after the letter, that Thomas had carried what he carried the only way Thomas Harwell knew how to carry anything. Privately, methodically, with a long-term plan in place, and without requiring anyone to witness the process. She says that the same qualities that made him slow to act and reluctant to speak were the qualities that had made him build something for her over 9 years, quietly and without credit, that protected her exactly the way he had always meant it to. She says that she cannot hold those two things apart from each other. She says that he was not a perfect man, but she says he was a good one. She says, he told me the truth. He just needed to find the right moment. And I suppose, in the end, he found it. There is something this story asks of all of us that has nothing to do with fraud or investigation or insurance claims or the mechanics of a postmark at a Nashville distribution center. It asks something quieter and more unsettling and more personal than any of that. It asks us to sit honestly with the question of what we carry privately inside the life we have built with someone else. Not because privacy is the same as deception. Not because the things we hold close are always things we should be ashamed of or afraid to name, but because Thomas Harwell lived for 15 years with a locked drawer and a hidden account and a knowledge he could not speak out loud, and the person who slept beside him and planted tomatoes with him every spring and went to church with him most Sundays and built the entire architecture of her life around the assumption that she knew who he was. That person never knew, and she might never have known, if not for a Tuesday morning and a white envelope and a postmark that should not have existed. How well do we know the people we have built our lives with? Not in the suspicious way, not in the accusatory way, but in the honest, close, slightly uncomfortable way that a story like this one demands we at least be willing to ask. Thomas Harwell knew Margaret well enough to know exactly what she would need when he was gone. He knew the shape of what would protect her, and he spent 9 years quietly building it. And yet he could not look at her across the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where she read his letter 4 times over the course of a week, and say, I know something, and it involves someone you love, and I am afraid of what it will cost you to hear it. He was a man with limits. He carried them the only way he knew how. And on a Tuesday morning in October, from the postmark of a mailbox 120 miles away, he sent her everything he had been carrying. And she carried it inside. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it. Actually sit with it for a moment before you leave your answer in the comments. If you were Margaret Harwell, if you pulled that envelope from the mailbox on that Tuesday morning in the October fog, in your coat over your funeral clothes, and you read those 4 pages standing at the end of the driveway, what would you have done first? Would you have called the lawyer the same week? Would you have needed more time than that? Would you have confronted Darlene face to face? Or would you have handed everything to investigators and let the process do what it was built to do? And here is the harder question, the one I think says something more true about who we each are. If Thomas had come to you while he was still alive, sat down at the kitchen table on an ordinary evening, and told you there was something you needed to know about your closest friend, would you have wanted to hear it? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that without qualification. This community is the reason this channel exists, and your perspective on stories like this one is exactly what makes this conversation worth having. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about trust and marriage and the weight of what people carry privately inside a shared life, then hit subscribe, because we are not finished. The next story we are bringing you begins with a missing persons report that an entire town already knew the answer to. Every neighbor, every coworker, every person who had driven past that house on that road for years. Everyone, that is, except the detective who caught the case. That one is coming very soon. And I promise you, you are not ready for it.